In the area of focus on this course, faith, social justice, and public life, John Carr is one of the best minds and hearts in our subject area for this semester. He's also a dear friend and a colleague, and the best stuff that I'm working on normally in some way or another is with John. He staffs the bishops. I would say he leads the bishops in many ways on areas of social justice and peace and development. Maybe he'll tell you about his title. I hope you can tell him the story, John, about your title and what authority it confers on you and the responsibilities. But John is a great person to start this course as our first guest lecturer. So it's my delight tonight to introduce John Carr to all of you. John, please come and speak to us.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm here because of the topic. I'm here because of my respect for Georgetown University. My relationship to Jesuit education is I pay for it. And I always say tell my Jesuit friends the way they practice the option for the poor is by making me poor. And your parents may have the same reaction. I'm really here because of Jim, and he said nice things about me. I think Jim is one of the leaders of the Sanity Caucus in Washington and in the churches, and we're not sure who the other members are. There aren't too many, but I've really resented Jim for a long time, and I haven't told you this. My dad, on occasion, who's now 88 years old, good Catholic, Minnesota. I'm a product of a mixed marriage. Both my parents are Minnesota Catholics, but my dad's a Democrat and my mother was a Republican. She was from St. Paul and my dad from Minneapolis. Anyway, my dad calls and reads me paragraphs from Jim's books and says, how come the bishops can't talk like Jim? And I said, one, because there's one of Jim and there's 300 of them. But it is sort of frustrating to have him. But I do, as he suggested, I have one thing on Jim. I have a much more pompous title. How would you like to be Executive Director for Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops? I always think it sounds like something that Dr. King and Dr. Phil would do together. The story Jim referred to, I was once at one of the bishops' meeting in Chicago, and back then I had an even more pompous title. I was Secretary of Social Development and World Peace. And the bishops sort of take over this hotel, and I got on an elevator, and I had this big name card that said United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, my name and my title. And the couple got on the elevator with me, and they were looking at me sort of strangely. And finally the guy said, "You're not a bishop." And I don't know whether it was the way I was dressed or my wedding ring that gave me away, but I said, no, I'm not a bishop. I work for the bishops. And I could see he was reading the rest of the name card, and he turned to his wife and he said, he's in charge of social development and world peace. And she seemed a little underwhelmed by this. She looked at me and said, you need to do a better job. So I guess that's true, actually. We all need to do a better job of connecting faith, poverty, and public life, which is the theme of this course and of tonight. So I'm happy to be here. What I'd like to do, if I can figure out the logistics, is break my comments up into three parts. What is the mission and message of Christians, in my case Catholics, in connecting faith and public life and poverty? What is the context? What are we up against? And what are some of the assets we bring What do we bring to the table as a community of faith? And then I want to give you a couple examples of the priority we set and the policies we pursue. Begin with by just saying, let's be clear who we are and who we are not when we come out of our faith tradition. We're a community of faith. We're not a political interest group. What brings us together is the Word of God, and for Catholics, the teaching of our church. We're not the Democratic Party of Prayer. We're not the religious caucus of the Republican Party. We're not the Chamber of Commerce, you know, with investments, or the AFL-CIO in sackcloth. I bet all of you have worked on a mission statement for some activity you've been involved in. I always want to begin by saying, what is our mission statement in public life? And I've worked on a whole bunch of them. I think they're really good. We put them in a pamphlet and we never look at them again. But the best mission statement I've ever read was what Jesus said when he was in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. And I would suggest this is the task of the church in public life in this area. The Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and to set the downtrodden free. That was Jesus' mission on earth, and I believe that's our mission in public life today. Got him in trouble, gets us in trouble. Obviously, this mission is not new. This has been the work of believers since Genesis. It's as old as the Hebrew prophets. You can just hear the passion for the poor in their words and in their writing. Jim, in the White House, when we were meeting with the president, quoted a passage about woe to those who make unjust decrees and place burdens on the poor. And I was looking around at the White House staff, and they were a little uncomfortable. They thought Jim was going to preach, but he was just reading. And it's as clear as Matthew 25. For those of you who know the scriptures, it's the only description we have of the Last Judgment. I'm Irish. I want to know what the question's going to be. And it turns out there's only one question. What did you do for the least of these? The hungry, the homeless, the sick, those in prison. So our faith calls us to look at our lives, at public life, at the economy from the bottom up. How does it touch the least of these? There's another way of describing this. The Apostle John, very close to Jesus, wrote a letter to the early church. And it essentially was a very simple message. God is love. Pope Benedict XVI, who is the head of the Roman Catholic Church that I'm a part of, also wrote a letter to us a couple years ago, and with the same message, God is love. Deus Caritas Est, it was called. It's an encyclical. And what he said was, love of God and love of neighbor have become one. In the least of the brethren, we find Jesus himself, and in Jesus we find God. So for those of you who are familiar with the scriptures, people came forward and said, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Love God or love neighbor? And the Pope says, those two have become one. And says, if you're looking for God, you'll find him in the poor. And that's where you'll find Jesus. The Pope said, love for the widows and orphans, prisoners, and the sick and needy of every kind is as essential to the church as the ministry of the sacraments and the preaching of the gospel. This may not sound like a big deal to you. He says the church cannot neglect the service of charity any more than she can neglect the sacraments and the word. What that says is that there are three things which make the church: proclaiming the gospel, celebrating the sacraments, and caring for and standing with the poor. That's not Jim Wallis in one of those great books. That's not me. It's not some banner. That is the chief teacher of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, people say, well, that's no big deal. Charity, we love the poor, we care for the poor. Everybody does that, and that gives no mandate for all this advocacy you're a part of. Well, the Pope goes on. What he does is he lifts up charity and places it at the center of our faith. And then he gives the most demanding definition of charity I've ever seen. He says, if we love others with charity, then first of all, we are just towards them. Not only is justice not extraneous to charity, justice is inseparable from it and intrinsic to it. Justice is the primary wear of charity. So if you follow the path of charity, I'm concerned for the poor, it begins with justice. And then he goes on to say, every Christian is called to practice this charity, the institutional path of charity, the political path of charity. And that is no less effective, no less excellent than the kind of charity where we take care of people ourselves. So the kind of charity that Jim is known for, the kind of charity we're doing together in the White House, on Capitol Hill, and in op-eds and in our work around the country, that is as important, according to the leader of my church, as every other form of charity. So that's the mission, that's the message. Talk a little bit about context. This is a word cloud from the President's State of the Union address. And a lot of words. You remember it was really long. This is the word cloud from Paul Ryan's response to the State of the Union. Fewer words, but a lot of them. And this is the word cloud from Representative Bachmann's response on behalf of the Tea Party. Now you can look back at those three, and there are a lot of words, hundreds of words. There are two words which do not appear: poverty or poor. President Obama was the first president since 1948, first Democratic president, to never mention the poor or poverty in a State of the Union address. And Representative Ryan didn't talk about it, and Representative Bachmann. Part of me says, where is the compassionate conservatism of George Bush or Jack Kemp? John Edwards is in a lot of trouble for a lot of things. But I thought his message of two Americas, of lifting up the place of the poor in our society, was something we needed to hear. And there's no compassion right now in conservatism. And frankly, there's not much talk about the other America in democratic life. In Washington, Matthew 25 is whatsoever you do for the forgotten middle class, you do unto me. The poor have disappeared in public life. They've disappeared from our vision, from our rhetoric, from our policies. And even the day before yesterday, when those terrible numbers came out, precious little commentary about this national failure. And that's the other sign of the time. That's the other context we have. We are part of a broken economy. It may be powerful, it may be affluent, it may be productive, but it is failing in fundamental ways. It fails to provide jobs for all those who need it. It fails to provide dignity for lots of families who are growing up in poor. Fails to provide health care and other basic necessity to literally millions and millions of people. One of the ways the bishops have talked about our economy, they said we're one nation, but we're really living in four different economies. In one economy, there are some people, a few people, who are really pulling ahead with enormous rewards, financial and other ways. And the data from 2 days ago confirmed that. There's a lot of people left behind. 15% of our neighbors are living in poverty in the richest nation on earth. 1 in 5 children. A lot of people left behind. And then there are a lot of us sort of in the middle that are really squeezed, wondering whether we'll keep our jobs, whether we can afford health insurance, frankly, whether we can afford tuition, not only at Georgetown, but at the community college. And the fourth economy are the people in the shadows of American life and economic life, immigrants without status, without papers, who do a lot of the dirty work. So we are in a broken economy. I would suggest the other context we're in is demoralized politics. We're demoralized in the sense that we can't get our act together. We can't accomplish anything. We can't raise the debt ceiling without, 3 months of turmoil. We can't win a war, doesn't look like. We can't run an economy. I think we're demoralized in another sense, which is we've lost a sense of priority, that the least of these are missing, that our values are not present. And I would argue that is a result of too much of two different kinds of individualism. Among conservative Republicans, I would say it's market individualism, economic individualism, where tax cuts are the solution to every problem. I'm a 60-year-old white church bureaucrat. I make a very good living, actually, as a church bureaucrat. I wouldn't tell the bishops that. And as I read the Ryan budget and the president's plan, the sacrifice I'm called to make to reduce the deficit, to pay for the wars, to get us out of this mess is exactly zero. No one's touching my tax deductions. No one's touching my tax cut. My Social Security and Medicare is apparently going to be just fine. Zero. My daughter teaches, we were talking, Cherry Hill in Baltimore in high school. The kids in her school are going to lose a lot. They're going to lose some of the school lunch program. They're going to use job training programs. They may lose the food stamps that their family depends on. There's threats, perhaps, to the earned income tax credit their parents live on. So there's disparity of sacrifice. Everybody says we need to share the burden, but the sharing seems very narrow. The other individualism, and this could be controversial, I would argue is a democratic individualism, which elevates choice to the ultimate value in public and personal life. So there's no sense of sacrifice, very little sense of the common good. And frankly, if you listen to the Democrats, Big Bird and NPR seem to have a much higher priority than poor and hungry children in the budget fights. So missing in all this is jobs, although we're starting to focus on it, poverty, although we did a report, the hungry families in our communities, and in some ways what we're really missing is the human costs of this. What is it like to be a parent, to not be able to feed your kids? What is it like to work for years and years and lose a job and not get a job back? Not even get an interview. What does that do to pride? What does that do to responsibility in the family? What does that do to your sense of participation in the community? So, if that's the context, i.e., a broken economy, demoralized politics, and a failure to recognize that the people at the bottom are getting lost, what do we bring to this as a community of faith? To look at the title, what does faith bring to poverty discussion in public life? Well, I would suggest we bring 4 things. We bring a framework, a way of thinking about this. We bring experience. It's what we do every day. It's where we are, and it's who we are. The Bible says, without a vision, the people perish. I think we've got a powerful vision as Catholics, as Christians. It's a vision that doesn't leave us free to abandon the unborn because they're politically incorrect, or immigrants because they don't vote. It does not fit the partisan categories of left or right, Democrat or Republican. In many ways, it's politically incorrect. It is both clear and I think complex. I kid Jim and say Catholic social teaching is a lot of things, but is especially a lot more complicated than what would Jesus do. This is a list of the letters that popes in the last 100 years have written to the Catholic community about questions of work and justice and economy and war and peace. And I would tell you, while we're known for our concern about sexual matters, about family, there are a lot more letters about this than there are about that. But I'm not going to go through all those letters. That's not part of the reading. What I am going to do is suggest a different way of looking at Catholic teaching. And I've left for you a little card that summarizes, actually 2 cards, that try to summarize a century of Catholic teaching in just a few words. I always tell the story of a woman who lost her husband, Fred. Fred was a good man. He is a good father, very active in the community, and when he died, his wife sat down and wrote out a 4-page single-spaced obituary. She took it down to the local community newspaper and she said, "I want you to print every word of this." And the clerk looked at it and said, "Well, we'll be happy to do that, but it's 7 cents a word. That's going to be really expensive." And she said, "Well, I can't afford that." She took it back and she wrote, "Fred is dead," and handed it back. And the clerk said, "Well, that'll be a lot less expensive, but we have a 7-word minimum." And she said, "Okay, Fred is dead, 88 Oldsmobile for sale." Well, what I'm about to give you is the Fred is dead version of Catholic social teaching. And the way I would describe it is to say the most important word in Catholic social teaching is the word and, A-N-D. It begins with human life and dignity. Life is central. It is essential. It is the beginning, but it's not all there is. It is linked to dignity. Human rights and responsibilities. We have a right to life and those things which make life truly human: faith and family, work and education, housing and health care. And we also have responsibilities to one another, to the larger society, and to secure those rights not just for ourselves, but for others as well. Family and community. The priority for the poor and vulnerable. The poor ought to come first. The dignity of work and the rights of workers, a core principle of this. Solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity is a word we've come to know, the sense of we belong together, we're part of one family. Subsidiarity is another word that's thrown around. It's not in the spell check for word or word perfect. And subsidiarity is about relationships. It means that large institutions should not overwhelm small institutions. The government should not interfere with family life, but it also works the other way around, that when family and neighborhood and community can't meet needs, can't assure protection of rights, they have a right to call on the larger institutions of society, of law and government and nation and state. The way I sort of summarize it is, in the aftermath of Katrina, what we all did, what Georgetown did, what every evangelical church in America did, what every Catholic school did to try and help, that's solidarity. We took one look at what was happening and we said that's not right, and we tried to help. That's solidarity in action. Subsidiarity was illustrated by the failure of local government, of state government, of federal government to act, and they turned a natural disaster into a man-made catastrophe. An environmental ethic of caring for the earth, but also caring for the wretched of the earth. And the common good, which is really all those ands put together. So remember, I'm trying to describe our assets. So I would argue that these ideas are our assets. They give us a different way of looking at the world, a different way of looking at the budget, the deficit debate. The other realities we have, and while it says Catholic assets, this is true, I think, of many institutions in our society, that is our experience. Who shelters the homeless? Who feeds the hungry? Who cares for the sick? Who educates the young? Who welcomes immigrants? Churches provide the largest non-governmental programs of education, healthcare, and human services. So when we go on Capitol Hill, my experience is they're more often interested in what we do than what we believe. The third sort of set of assets is our institutional presence. We're everywhere. A Protestant friend of mine, evangelical friend, said, "You Catholics are terrific. You divide up the world and you call it yours. We have all these parishes, 20,000 parishes. We have 10,000 schools. We have 700 colleges, not all as prestigious as Georgetown. We got 600 hospitals. We're in every congressional district. We're in every state. We're rural and urban. We're in the inner city, and we're in the gated communities. And we have people, and some of those peoples are leaders, like the Pope, like the bishops I work for. But I would argue that more importantly are the people who are not rich and famous, who don't have lots of power. There are 65 million Catholics in America, according to Pew. Between 30 and 40% of them go to church every Sunday. That's a problem. It used to be a lot higher. I think what that means is about 25 million Catholics in church every weekend. What would MoveOn.org give for that? What would NBC News give for that? What would the Tea Party give for that? I said, without a vision, the people perish. Well, it's also true, without a people, the vision is invisible. How do we put the vision and people together? A friend of mine said, if you ever got your act together, you'd be dangerous. So the question is, how do we put our act together? And here's where we come to some of the work we're doing together. Jim asked me to talk about the Circle of Protection. Notice our fancy logo. It's a very informal group. It started with about 7 leaders of groups. Jim and I were there. We're not much on design, I'll tell you that. But I think we've got a very powerful idea. The idea is the moral measure of our society, and therefore our budget, is how it touches the weak. Jim says over and over again, the budget is a moral document as well as an economic, financial document. So we look at those budgets from the bottom up. We look at every plan for deficit reduction from the bottom up. We look at the jobs plan for how it touches the poor and vulnerable. And we recognize that in Washington, everyone's got an advocate, except the poor. They don't have K Street on their side, so we're going to have to try and be their voices. So we argue that we ought to draw a circle of protection around those resources that help the poorest people live in dignity. Food stamps, unemployment insurance, Medicaid. We don't say those programs are perfect. Frankly, we spend most of the year trying to improve those programs. But we say you shouldn't balance the budget on the back of those programs. Instead of targeting those programs, which is what has been happening, we ought to try and protect those programs. There are 8 principles that guide the circle of protection. One is we can't live with these deficits, with this accumulating debt. It's morally responsible. It's an obligation to address that. But how you go about it is also a moral challenge. That the effort to overcome poverty, to serve those in need, should not be cut. The programs that serve their needs directly should not be targeted. They can be improved, they can be reformed, they can be made better, but they should not be abandoned. We're talking about poor people at home, but we're also talking about the poorest people on earth, for whom the kind of cuts that are being envisioned are literally matters of life and death. People with AIDS who won't get drugs, farmers who won't get the help they need to raise the food that feeds their families. And that shared sacrifice ought to be shared. And we ought to look at tax revenues, we ought to look at entitlement programs, we ought to look at the military, as well as discretionary programs. Another theme is, I don't know if it's conservative or liberal, which is the best way to overcome poverty, to reduce the deficit, is work. Work at decent wages is the best way out of poverty, and we need economic growth. And so all the talk about jobs and economic growth, those aren't just political talking points, those have moral dimensions as well. And then as religious leaders, we ask ourselves different questions. How does this affect the poor and vulnerable? How do we share sacrifice? And then Jim always has a gift for the soundbite. What would Jesus cut? And we pray, and we sacrifice, and we fast, and we bring a unique perspective. And that is what we have done together. And we've done it together in the White House, we've done it together on Capitol Hill, we've talked to Republicans, we've talked to Democrats, and we're doing it together. And just a word, we sort of built from the center out. Catholic bishops are nobody's idea of a left-wing group. The National Association of Evangelicals are often considered a conservative group. The Salvation Army, as well as the National Council of Churches, Sojourners, Bread for the World, and others. So we have pulled together a remarkable representation of the Christian community around a very simple idea, that the moral measure of the budget debate is how it touches the poor. Let me conclude by just suggesting, based on these principles, based on our experience, what would be a way, a strategy, to overcome poverty? And what I'd like to offer is a metaphor. It's a table with 4 legs. One leg of how to overcome poverty is what individuals ought to do, what families ought to do. We ought to sacrifice for our kids. We ought to go to school. We ought to get married before we have children. We ought to find work if we can. We ought to make good decisions as a family, as a person. Secondly is what community, church, faith-based institutions, to use the word of the moment, ought to do. How do we support families in those choices? How do we defend them against injustice? Catholic Church, in my little department, we invest $10 million a year in community organization to help low-income families and low-income communities have a voice in their own development, how they break the cycle of poverty. Thirdly is what the market ought to do, what business, what employers, what unions ought to do. We need jobs that pay decent wages and decent benefits so that people can live in dignity. Work ought to be an escape from poverty, not another version of poverty. And then government at every level, local, state, and federal, has responsibilities to act when those other institutions fail, to ensure the basic needs and human rights are respected, to act when other institutions fail. So individuals and families, communities, churches, the market and business, and government. 4 legs, 1 table. The problem with Washington, in my experience, is everybody falls in love with 1 leg of the table. Some people think this is all a matter of personal responsibility. Others say faith-based groups ought to do it. Lots of people believe the market is the solution to every problem, including poverty, and there are still a few liberals around who think government is the solution. Our way, I think, is how do we get those institutions to work together? What do we do in terms of our advocacy, and I'm going to conclude with this. How do we go about it so we're not righteous, sort of tiresome, shrill, ignored, ineffective? I'd like to suggest that we are political but not partisan. A lot of these decisions are made in public life, but they don't belong to one party. So we're not cheerleader for any administration. We're not chaplain to any party. We are principled but not ideological, or we should be. We have some basic fundamentals: respect for human life, a priority for the poor. And we're not going to give in on those, but we'll work with anybody to advance those priorities, no matter what their ideology, what their party. So we've been meeting with the Speaker's office. We've been meeting with Paul Ryan. We've been meeting at the White House. We've met with the Speaker, the Majority Leader. We're trying to find allies wherever we can find them. We should be civil but not soft. I don't think religious leaders can advocate charity and justice and treat people uncharitably or unjustly. We should not be impugning the motives of others. Our adversaries are not evil. They see things in a different way. And we should be engaged but not used. We have to be deeply involved, but we have to do so in a principled way. Let me illustrate this with a story. We sought a meeting with the President of the United States to make our case. And religious leaders and the President get together on a regular basis. And frankly, it's often empty of meaning. It's essentially a photo op. Jim was in charge of how we were going to do that. And we said we wanted to meet the President, but we wanted to do so to make our case, not to have our picture taken. And so we refused to meet until we had laid the groundwork, until we had a substantial opportunity to make our case to the President. So with Jim's help, we were engaged but not used, and you know what? That made a difference. In the final negotiations, the White House fought for one provision that would say that, and we can get into this if you want, that when the sequester, when the mandatory cuts come down, low-income entitlement programs like food stamps, like unemployment insurance, like Medicaid, would not be subject to the automatic cuts. I think that was very much a result of our efforts to influence not only the administration, but Paul Ryan and the Speaker. So we were engaged but not used. When I talk about this stuff, when I especially, quote the scriptures and, talk about the principles and talk about politics, we can forget what this is really all about. And I'll conclude with a story. I gave a talk to a group of Catholic business leaders in upstate New York. And I thought the talk had gone great. I sort of outlined all the principles. I had these little handouts I'm going to leave for you. And most folks were very kind and complimentary, except one guy. And unfortunately, he was the president of the group, and unfortunately, I was seated next to him. And he was really mad. And so I said, "What? You seem very irritated. What's the problem?" He goes, "You don't want to know." And frankly, by then, I didn't want to know. But I was in too deep. I said, "No, tell me." He said, "I'm tired of all this talk about the poor, immigrants, solidarity. What about me? What about people like me? Pay the taxes. I contribute to the church every Sunday. Is there anything in those encyclicals for me? Those letters? I work hard." And I've responded. I talked about Matthew 25. I quoted John Paul II. I was getting nowhere. And I took a different tack. I said, "What do you do for a living?" He said, "I'm a lawyer." I found out later he was the managing partner of the major law firm in that city. And I said, "Well, you talked about how hard you work. When you're working late, do you ever run across the people who clean your office?" He said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Well, tell me about it." He said, "Well, it's a woman. She's from another country. She's been around a while." I said, "Well, what do you pay her?" And he said, well, we don't really pay her. We hire a company and they hire her. I said, come on, what do you pay her? He says, well, probably minimum wage. I said, does your firm have a health plan? He says, yeah, a good plan. It covers families. Costs a lot of money, costs him more money every year. I said, does the woman who cleans your office, who scrubs the toilet and dusts the desk and vacuums the rug, is she a part of your health plan? He goes, well, no, I told you, it's a contract. He said, what are you getting at? I said, what I'm getting at is this is not about politics. It's not about Barack Obama and John McCain. It's not about the Chamber of Commerce or the AFL-CIO. This is about whether the woman who cleans your office, whether she and her husband can raise their kids in dignity, whether she can take her kids to the doctor when they get sick. And he looked at me and said, well, why didn't you say so? I think part of our challenge is to make sure that nobody, whether they're a Catholic in the pew or the President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, or a member of the Tea Party or the Black Caucus, nobody can say to the Christian community, why didn't you say so? Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much. You've given us a lot to work with here. Now, this is our first time we've done this in this class, so we have a guest lecture for each of our 5 topics. And we just had the first one. We're off to a great start. What we'll do now is I'm going to ask John a couple of questions. We can chat back and forth. Then over to you to ask John questions about which you saw in the readings or which you heard tonight. Then we'll break. Then we'll come back and we'll really get into even further into what your reflections said. And your reflections set up some good conversations between some of you in terms of what one said and what the other said. So we're going to get you talking to each other about that. And John's going to stay for a while, as long as he can. So let's use this time with John very, very well. John, let me start with something that a number of the students in the readings were concerned about, which is, I know you're very concerned about this too, how now in the new calculations of budget cuts, the defense budget has been lumped in with spending on international aid and development, kind of a new calculation. And so when they make the cuts, you've got malaria bed nets competing with the drones. And I know the bishops are very concerned about this. Many of us are. So explain kind of how that happened and what now the threat is, who's in jeopardy because of that, and what response to it that we can make.
Sure. Hello, test.
Should be good.
Testing, 1. All right. Say the way you can tell you're at a Catholic meeting is no one sits in the front pew and the audio visuals never work. So this is not a Catholic meeting. 2 initial thoughts about that is one, the one area, probably the most productive area of bipartisan work against poverty in the last administration was around development, was around PEPFAR. George Bush's compassionate conservatism I didn't find very evident in domestic policy, but I give him enormous credit for his priority and personal involvement in PEPFAR, HIV/AIDS, malaria, and development assistance. For the first time, assistance to the poorest people on earth and smart assistance that was results-oriented went up. Bill Clinton gave the best speeches and had the worst budgets in this area. George Bush didn't give as good a speech, but he had much better budgets. And I think Bill Clinton's sort of paying a price with the Clinton initiative and all that. Jim's a part of all that. I think he's sort of making up for what he didn't do in the White House. But it's a tragedy that that area of common concern is threatened to be undermined, deeply undermined by the budget thing. And the last part of the deal was particularly unfortunate. And it was Mitch McConnell who called Vice President Biden, who was negotiating for the White House, and they were very worried about the defense cuts. The idea is if we make the penalty for not getting a deal so terrible, it'll be health cuts for the Democrats and military cuts for the Republicans. If the costs of not making a deal are so terrible, it will really drive us towards a deal. And so there were very major cuts in military that were being proposed if they didn't get a deal. And this made the Republican leadership very unhappy. And so Mitch McConnell called Vice President Biden and said, how about this? Instead of focusing on the Pentagon, we'll create a new category called security. And that includes the Pentagon, Homeland Security, and everything that's in the State Department, including every dollar of assistance for malaria, for HIV/AIDS, for development assistance, for poor farmers, for debt relief. And they agreed to it. I don't even know what they thought about it. They were so anxious to have a deal. And so now the likelihood is we'll find, as Jim said, BedNet's competing with drones. And while I'd love to make the case that BedNets are a lot more cost efficient than drones, we're going to be up against all of K Street on this one. We're going to have lots of defense contractors who have lots of jobs in everybody's district saying, we're going to have Hillary Clinton saying, look, we have to fund the embassy in Romania, and you know, that money is going to compete against development assistance. I think my hope is that by working together, by working with Republican leaders and the White House, that we can recover the sense of common purpose that said we're not going to abandon the poorest people on earth. For believers, this is literally a matter of life and death. When I was at Catholic Relief Services this afternoon in Baltimore, the drugs that we give with the help of the U.S. taxpayers help parents live to see their kids grow up. It's literally resurrection work. And we think we have a chance. It won't be easy, but we have a chance to make the case that we shouldn't abandon that work. It not only is wrong morally, but it also will make the world less safe and more insecure.
So get your questions ready for John. I'm going to ask him one more, then it's over to you.
This is really funny, me answering Jim's questions, because he answers our questions better than I do.
A lot of the reflections asked a very good question of both you and I think, saying in effect, this is very morally compelling, admirable, almost, you know, it's very defensible. But does it really have any leverage politically in this town? What leverage, John, do faith communities have on something like this? Is it just a moral argument? What leverage do we have with individual lawmakers, particularly if they're people of faith? And then what leverage does our constituency or constituencies have with the outcomes? You said you thought we made a difference in some, we helped protect some of what we wanted to protect. So what leverage do we have, and why do figures have that kind of leverage?
Well, there's an old story. I've probably told it to Jim, but when the Civil Rights Bill was before the Senate, Jim Eastland was the chair from Alabama, and he was very unhappy that the major religious groups were supporting the Civil Rights Bill. And so he said, I won't do the accent, but he said, I want to know who you think you're speaking for. I want you to tell me who you claim to speak for and when you last spoke to them, thinking that, you know, he'd demonstrate how out of touch the churches were. And, you know, the Presbyterian Church said we had the Synod meeting in Cincinnati last June, and we passed a resolution, and the central body of rabbis said we met in Miami and we took a position. Well, we had a guy by the name of Monsignor John McCarthy, now a bishop, who looked at the chairman and said, "Mr. Chairman, I want to answer your question. I speak for God, and I spoke to him this morning." That's not good enough today. We can't just say we speak for God, we speak for morality. We have to demonstrate that we know what we're talking about, that we have facts, that we have experience, that these investments, in fact, make a difference. And then we have to link it to what happens at home. Sojourners has this great idea of come and see, that when they're home on recess, they ought to come to the shelter, they ought to come to the soup kitchen, they ought to come to the work place center and see the numbers that were announced the other day. For us, they're names and faces, they aren't abstractions. We do a lot of work having bishops call members of Congress. We do a lot of work trying to get Catholics involved, contacting their members of Congress, trying to make the case. But we also appeal to their conscience. When we were in the White House, we made the case that this was good economics, good politics, but we also said this is the right thing to do and appeal to the president's conscience. So we got to find a way to do all of that. And occasionally we break through.
I was intrigued by how Paul Ryan, who is a Catholic and has been in this whole process pretty confident and self-assured and pretty kind of out there, when there was a meeting with John and some others, was quite, shall we say, sensitive to the idea that maybe his budget might not be in keeping with Catholic social teaching. John Boehner had some similar concerns, which provided a very different kind of leverage than a liberal Democratic group might have had.
There are two moments it seemed that the Republicans have been most off balance in this debate. One was when the Democrats picked up on Ryan's proposal to voucherize Medicare and sort of drove that as far as they could. The second was the hint that as active Catholic laymen who talked about their faith, that their positions might not be consistent with their faith, and they got very anxious about that. Ryan has written a couple articles about why he thinks he's doing the right thing. We think it's terrific to have a debate in the Catholic community about what our faith requires. We think we ought to have that discussion. Frankly, there's almost no discussion in the country about what our national values require in terms of overcoming poverty. What does liberty and justice for all mean in a country where 1 out of 4 kids is growing up poor? When Black and African American and Hispanic families are far more likely to be poor and out of work. Let's have that discussion and let's hear whether trickle down, bottom up, tax cuts, programs, whatever. Let's have that discussion. But right now the silence is deafening and we're trying to convene that discussion.
On the other side, there was another moment in the White House meeting when the president, who, says he's a Christian and from a black church and all the rest, had an adult conversion, was trying to explain why we have to appeal to the middle class and to the center, and why all kinds of talk about poverty may not be very effective. And the president said, and then the bishop said in response to the president, let me tell you about Matthew 25. And the president says to the bishop, well, you got me there, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's be candid. I watched this on the tape. The White House has made a calculation that a black president can't talk about the poor. I think they're wrong. I think they're fundamentally wrong politically, economically, socially, morally, religiously, but they've made that calculation. And every once in a while, the president slips. and talks about we are our sisters and brothers' keeper. Bishop Ramirez was in the White House for us, and he goes, you know, when you slip and talk that way, that's good. You need to do more of that. And the communication maestros in the White House sort of winced about that.
So there is a way that sometimes when the political leader is a person of faith, there's a way that you can really appeal to that within them. The other thing I remember in a meeting, another meeting in the White House, that they said that they were quite aware of the constituency that we brought into the room. When you have the Bishops' Conference, National Association of Evangelicals, the Salvation Army, in fact, even the American Bible Society, in the room, they know you're talking about a lot of people who are not necessarily their base, and in fact are in the center of the country that they want to appeal to, which also adds to the conversation. So, who has a question for John? Yes, sir. And
yeah, as you were talking about sort of appealing to a politician's faith and moral conscience, one sort of verse that I was thinking of is when it says that God loves a cheerful giver. And I was wondering, like, most of the time when you get leaders to act morally, is it done out of obligation, or is it usually that, or are they sometimes really kind of excited to sort of help in a joyful way, or at least an enthusiastic way? And if it usually is obligation sort of sustainable in a sense?
Mm-hmm. That's really good. A friend of mine says there's nothing worse than a grim do-gooder. I mean, we can come across as people you would not like to spend the weekend with. You know, you sort of carry the world around your shoulders. You know, you never do enough. You'll never have a Saturday free. I would like to think that one of the things that's really important about our faith is it gives us a different way of looking at the world, but it also ought to give us a different way of acting. We have a certain sense of hope. We have a sense of the human person. I'm a Catholic, so I know a lot about guilt. My experience is guilt is not very motivating. Empowerment is. You can make a difference is. You can do the right thing is. On the other hand, saying you're falling short, every time we say that the silence on poverty is deafening, we see people wince because they know that this should be something our country talks about. So it's a combination of, I think, of challenge and support. Archbishop Dolan is president of our Bishops' Conference. We write these letters that he signs. He always now we do, but he always puts up front, the first thing I want to do is thank you for your service to our country and the sacrifice your family makes. It's not easy, it's a wonderful vocation, and we need more of that, frankly.
yes, sir.
What happens when you encounter a member who is not a person of faith? Does your message change at all, or your tactics change?
Not much, frankly. If they're meeting with us, it's because they've chosen to. And while they may not be a member, they have a certain respect for who we are. Even people who disagree with us. Almost everybody says at the beginning of the meeting, you know, one of the unique things about this session is you're not here for yourselves. And Washington is full of people who are here for themselves. So we make the case not primarily on biblical terms. I mean, I would not lead with, you know, Luke 4 in a meeting with a Jewish member. Jesus' vocation on earth is of less interest. But I'd still make the case that to be the kind of society that we want to be, to reflect our values, we can't leave all these people behind. The other thing is we believe that this is not only good morality, it's good economics, and it's good policy, and that there's something dangerous about a society that's pulling apart further and further and further apart, and that you don't have to believe in the virgin birth to believe that having more and more of our kids growing up poor is a serious threat to, and not who we are. So there is a common good that is not religiously based, but is shared, and we would appeal on that basis. Those are the folks who are usually most impressed with what we do instead of what we say. There's a story, there was a proposal during welfare reform that would say that if you're on welfare and you get pregnant, there would be no more help for that child. It's called the family cap. And we opposed it for two reasons. One, it increased abortion in our minds, but it also hurt that kid and that family. And we had a meeting with Senator Dole, who was the majority leader of the Senate at the time. And on one side of the table was the Christian Coalition, and on the other side of the table was the Catholic bishops. They were for the provision because they really felt it would decrease promiscuity. We thought that people rarely had sex thinking of the welfare benefits that they would get. But Senator Dole was in a bad place. We don't endorse candidates, the Christian Coalition does, and he was going to run for president. Well, he went up and he said, literally, the speech is out there, he says, I have my friends in the Christian Coalition, and I have my friends in the Catholic Church, and they're all my friends. He said, on this one, I'm going with the bishops because they help these women that were in those communities and were caring for women who are pregnant and with nobody else to help. And he said, so I'm going with them on this. And we felt really good about it. 4 months later, he appeared before the Christian Coalition and he changed his position because he needed their help.
Very good point. Okay, Greg, good questions.
I guess I have two sort of policy questions. You mentioned the GOP plan with Medicare, and that's obviously very controversial. I guess in that plan they provide, sort of premium support payments, and I guess their rationale, maybe in defense to some of your concerns, would be they provide greater support payments to people of lower income and those who are sick. I think it's like about 92% of full support payments. Do you think that goes far enough, and what are your major concerns with that proposal? More broadly, what are your thoughts on sort of the 90s welfare reforms and sort of the 1996 bill, which maybe even brought down poverty rates?
Mm-hmm. A couple of thoughts, and Jim ought to answer these as well as me. We're not in principle opposed to vouchers. In fact, our church thinks that in a place like Washington, D.C., when it comes to education, when you have terrible public schools, there ought to be alternatives available. Our problem was that, and the one thing I would give Representative Ryan great credit for is he tries to target most of the assistance on those most in need. And I frankly think he says that's part of who he is, and that's part of the Catholic who he is. The dilemma was that because he was also trying to save a lot of money, that the vouchers weren't enough, and they didn't grow over time. We're in this terrible position where healthcare spending increases at a rate far higher than the rest of inflation. And so over time, even if you started out with an adequate amount of money, and a lot of people felt it wasn't adequate, that it would diminish and diminish and diminish, and by giving it to the states and ending the entitlement feature, entitlement sounds like a bad word, what it means is that you're going to get what you need. And by changing that and putting it at the vagaries of the state budget process, it meant, frankly, that we were going to have a lot of people who weren't going to be able to afford health insurance in the private market. The second part of your question was the welfare reform. We were for work requirements. While it may be the Protestant work ethic, they've converted us. We think work is not a burden. It's not because Eve ate the apple, Adam ate the apple. We think work is a way you contribute to the common good. It's a way you participate in God's creation. But as I said in the presentation, work ought to be a way to leave poverty, not another form of poverty. And so helping people get the skills they need for good jobs ought to count as getting ready, not phony. There are some crummy job training programs, but if a young woman with a baby finds a way to go to school and gets good grades, that ought to count. I mean, that's getting ready so she can support that child. So there were a lot of things beyond the basic idea where they seemed to be counterproductive. We also thought the treatment of immigrants was lousy. In order to save money at the end, they just said, you know, after all their wonderful speeches about how legal immigrants are great and illegal immigrants are terrible, they threw legal immigrants under the bus, and that's one of the reasons we didn't think it. I'll be honest that as the economy has gotten worse, the achievements of welfare reform have gotten less. It really depends on the availability of work for people with modest skills, and we've lost that capacity in our society. And one of the problems we have is that sometimes people who are trying the hardest are having the hardest time. Yeah. So we were not among those who were celebrating the status quo. We want kids to go to school and talk about what their parents do instead of what their parents get.
Just to add to that last one, we were both involved in that one too. I think we both had the principle, welfare reform ought to have the purpose, not of just taking people off the welfare rolls, but lifting them out of poverty. And too many people were satisfied with getting them off the welfare rolls in new low-paying jobs, uncertain jobs that kept them in poverty, but they were not welfare anymore. And the other thing, I think I mentioned it in the last class, Call Renewal and the bishops were the only two voices in that debate that were in favor of both support for marriage and family and increasing child care. And the liberals all were on the child care side, conservatives are all on the support marriage side. And again, you know, John's, one of his basic points is, and I would reiterate that both and, I said last time, false choices do us in every time. So both and often becomes a very, very substantial alternative to the narrowness of both the left and the right on these questions.
Let me just build on that. There are two tragedies with the poverty debate. One is we have a lot more of it now, and the other is we're still stuck in the paralysis of it's the economics that matters or it's the personal responsibility that matters. One of the things about Catholics and evangelicals is we don't choose between those two. What I tried to say with the metaphor of the table, it's good choices on the part of parents, and it's economic policies that allow you to work, and it's government protection against discrimination, and it's a minimum wage law, and it's requirements that immigrants can't be exploited. So there are some people, generally on the left, who believe government action will overcome poverty, and there's other people generally on the right that say personal choices, wise personal choices, will overcome poverty. I think our position is it's going to require both of those and more to do it. And it would be great to find a way to break through the sort of ideological paralysis that right now leaves poor people trapped in an empty discussion.
A couple more maybe, then we'll take a break. So one or two more. Trent? Yeah.
All right. I come from a community where a large employer is a tank plant, a General Dynamics tank plant. So I feel this dilemma when I'm reading the Circle of Protection, and this plant is also on the list for closures if military spending cuts are to take place. So I'm in this dilemma where there's these great working class people who have played by the rules to get ahead, and then if these cuts are to come into place, they'll see that food stamps and these other programs for lower class are still in place and being protected, which really sets up, I think, a sort of I guess, like class warfare in between a middle class and a lower class families. And I was just wondering what you would say to a worker in that situation and how you would explain the circle of protections like idea and just kind of counsel them through that situation.
Sure. Tough question. One of the things I would say is the programs that are in the circle are touching families, like in that community. One of our colleagues is Drew Gensler. He's a Lutheran pastor. He's also a military chaplain. The use of food stamps in military commissaries is just going through the roof because the people we look to defend our country are not being paid enough to feed their families. In my tradition, we're for legitimate defense, but we don't need tanks that we don't need, and tanks are not a job program. On the other hand, when people make those kind of decisions, they have to take into account the human consequences of that, and we ought to be able to make something besides tanks on those lines. Whether it's, I'm not one of those who believes everybody's going to make wind turbines, you know, in the kingdom of God, but there ought to be a way to figure out how we can use skills that people have to make something useful. We sent people into Iraq without decent armor on those cars. So as long as we're going to be fighting these wars, we're going to need some armored cars and tanks that work. So I don't know the specific dynamics. I'm a member of the board of Bread for the World. I always say our goal is not to make sure everybody's on food stamps. Our goal is to make sure everybody can have a job so they can feed their own kids. And so we want those workers to be able to contribute to the common good and the life of that community by using the talents they have. And that requires us, frankly, to think and act differently. And frankly, a lot of the energy that goes into saving a tank plant we don't need could probably go into what else could we make at the tank plant that we do need.
Alex, did you hand up? Yeah, Alex across the table.
In your presentation, you touched on very quickly the fact that you'll work with anybody who's willing to work with you and protect the programs that you're seeking to protect. I was wondering if you could expand upon that. You know, obviously you come from a position of faith, and so I think that gives you something of a moral clarity. I was wondering how you balance, you know, the desire to broaden a coalition, you know, maybe work with other groups who aren't faith-based, with the fact that perhaps it muddies the moral message. It makes it more difficult to have a, you know, appeal to someone on the basis specifically of their faith. How you balance those two things when you're looking at tactics and ways to effectively advocate for your positions.
It's a really interesting question, because when we first started, Jim's part of a lot of coalitions. The Catholic Conference is a lousy coalition partner. We're very hard to deal with. We are not nimble. My church has been called a lot of things that has never been called trendy. I mean, we don't move very fast. But so we work in a lot of secular coalitions. We work in a lot of interfaith coalitions. And we decided from the very beginning that this was going to be different. For example, we wanted conservative Christian groups in this coalition. Some people think that describes me. And that meant that it was going to be Christian and not interfaith, even though we have very strong ties. It was going to be explicitly Christian, and it was not going to have the National Association of Social Workers or a lot of our secular allies. What Jim and I were at a meeting of sort of the traditional human service coalition. I helped start it 25 years ago. A lot of them are my friends, and there were two sort of feelings in the room, at least I felt it. One was a certain, who died and left you in charge? You know, we've been at this a long time, and you went off on your own and sort of captured the high moral ground here. And the second attitude was, thank God you did, because the way we've been going about this isn't working really well. And so what they did, quite surprisingly, they formed their own effort and said, you know what, we're not explicitly Christian, but we support the Circle of Protection too. And there was an interreligious effort where Jewish and Muslim and other groups said, that's what we want to do. I'm of the view, and this is sometimes an unpopular position, instead of writing a letter with 80 signatures, I think we need 80 letters. One for the Catholics, one from Sojourners, one from, instead of one letter that's got everybody listed. And then you try and be clear on what unites you and what divides you, and be respectful about that. Jim has spent a lifetime doing this.
Well, just on this was a good example of how to deal with your very good question. How do you work in coalition, because we were broadly in coalition with a lot of those folks, but not do exactly the same things with the same language in the same way. And in this case, it was quite stunning how they thought the faith-based effort had a better chance of breaking through and getting the meeting at the White House and all the rest. And they were quite happy for that to happen, because the message we had was, in fact, very similar to theirs. In the spring, some of us did a fast around all of this out of almost desperation. And I was very surprised that Justin Rubin of Move On, Mary Kay of SEIU, and some others were some of the first to join our fast. And they said, we were looking for a moral dimension, a moral angle to this. We couldn't find one, and we saw your fast. And we decided we would join the fast too. And they said, for them it provided, in fact, Move On had a day-long debate about whether to call for a fast in the Move On network. They had never posted a piece of scripture on a Move On email before. And the fast sounded too religious, but they decided to do it anyway. And it doubled our known numbers by the next day. And they said it provided for them, these are people who were not people of faith, but care about justice, provided for them, the language was an emotional, personal, and spiritual connection to the issue of budget justice. And so there was a very good kind of conversation the whole time between groups who respected each other, but at one point the secular folks said to us, you shouldn't join us because that might take away from your particular moral authority on this question. So it was a great example of working in partnership, but not all being the same and doing the same thing. I'm going to let John go home now. He's got an early trip in the morning. So I wanted this first session to be a bit longer here. We're going to break for about 5 minutes, then come back and really dig in these reflections that you all did, and still be out of here in time. But I want us all to share our appreciation for John and what he said to us tonight.
Thanks a lot.